The Battle of Gettysburg was a pivotal moment in the Civil War. For the South, it represented the end of any hope at waging an offensive war against the North. A popular misconception is that it also ended any hope of England aiding the South. This is incorrect because there was already no hope of England aiding the Confederacy. England had cheaper cotton sources in India and Egypt. They didn't see the North as an enemy, and they definitely didn't believe in states' rights. For the North, it solidified the South as an enemy, whereas many before still didn't necessarily want to fight. Many individuals saw no real reason to attack the South. To prevent them from seceding, some even sympathized with the Southern cause. This changed when the Confederacy invaded the North. By threatening those same individuals' homes and property, the South became a threat to their very existence. The Battle of Gettysburg was a direct result of the waning Southern influence on the Mississippi, and as a result, greater difficulty moving goods and troops. Unlike the North, the South didn't have an effective rail system for moving cargo. The rail systems they did have weren't standardized. This meant that the trains had to be unloaded and reloaded frequently. It also made the Southern rail system easy to sabotage, as the rails had to be custom manufactured. Gettysburg was essentially a continuation of General Ulysses S. Grant's sacking of Vicksburg. In hope of drawing Grant's army away from Vicksburg and thus relieve some of the pressure on the Mississippi area, General Lee pushed northwards towards Washington. One of Lee's goals was to catch Grant's army on the move and attack them while they were vulnerable. Lee also hoped that by threatening Washington, he could force the North to sue for peace in an increasingly unpopular war. As Lee moved northward, Major General Joseph Hooker's army gave chase. Because of political reasons, though, Hooker was replaced with General Meade. From his final position at Gettysburg, it would have taken Lee's army another 3 days' march in order to threaten the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Upon Lee's arrival at Gettysburg, Lee hadn't made up his mind to have a battle at Gettysburg. This is where disagreement set in among the Confederate generals. Many of the Confederate officers close to Lee sought glory and fame, and as a result wanted to attack the Union Army. Some even believed that their soldiers were better than the Union soldiers. A delusion brought on as a result of the Confederates having always fought defensive battles, and thus having always sustained lighter casualties than the Union. General Longstreet was different. Quote unquote, Longstreet wanted to fight a defensive position and let the Union Army attack them. He didn't want to attack the Union Army unless they were on the move. When entering the first day at Gettysburg, Lee was going in blind. The cavalry unit led by Jeb Stuart had normally served as Lee's eyes and ears, informing him on enemy positions and numbers. Instead of doing his job, Jeb Stuart decided to take his unit out to raid the surrounding area. This greatly hindered Lee, as it made making informed tactical decisions impossible. At 7:30 a.m. of July 1st, 1863, Lieutenant Marcellus Jones of the 8th Illinois Volunteer Cavalry fired the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg. On the first day, the Union dug into defensive positions such as Cemetery Ridge, setting the stage for Pickett's suicidal charge later in the battle. Union General John Reynolds took a Confederate bullet to the head, killing him. One school of thought is that he was shot by a Confederate sharpshooter. It is more likely that he caught a stray bullet around. The ridges of the northwest of the town were initially defended by the cavalry division under Brigadier General John Buford. As the day progressed, Buford's troops came under heavy Confederate attack and were pushed off these ridges and back into the defense position that remained for the rest of the battle. The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg served to commit the Union and Confederate armies to their roles. For the North, it allowed them to entrench in the defensive positions they needed. For the South, it locked them into the role of aggressor. On the morning of July 2nd, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg entered its second day. The Union and Confederate armies stared at each other across an open field. During the night, both sides received more troops. The Union forces now numbered in 60,000, while the Confederates had about 50,000 troops at Gettysburg. At 11 a.m., Lee made his move. He ordered Longstreet to attack south up the Emmitsburg Road toward Little and Big Round Tops, which appeared to be empty of Union troops. An attack here would strike the Union in its left flank. Since General Meade would be focused on the Confederates at Culp's Hill, which he could clearly see, this maneuver against his left flank would come as a bit of a surprise, and this was what Lee had assumed would be the case. The man in charge of leading the attack, General Longstreet, was not all convinced this was a good idea. He thought it would be better if he and his men snuck around the Union lines and came up behind them, thus forcing the Yankees to attack them. Longstreet was hoping that Lee would change his mind about this attack and cancel it. He therefore took his time getting to the attack positions ordered by Lee. It took him and his troops several hours to march south to where the attack would begin. When the Southern troops finally reached their attack positions, they quickly discovered that an entire Union corps was standing in their way. General Daniel Sickles led this corps. Sickles, led on without orders, moved his men well ahead of the rest of the Union line, setting up along the Emmitsburg Road, which offered slightly higher elevation. By doing this, he had separated himself from his own army and was in a very exposed position that could easily be attacked and outflanked. Seeing this, the Confederates had no choice but to attack this bulge in the Union line. It wasn't until around 4 p.m. in the afternoon that the Confederates finally launched their attack. General John Bell Hood and Lafayette McLaws led the two Confederate divisions taking place in this attack. The Confederate attack would be an Incline, which would start on their right flank and swing left to hopefully outflank and roll up the Federal lines. At this time, Lee ordered General Ewell to make a demonstration against Culp's Hill to tie up as many Union troops as possible and even make a full-fledged attack towards Culp's Hill if the opportunity presented itself. This demonstration would prevent the Union from shifting troops to the south to reinforce their troops. Meanwhile, the main attack in the south began, starting with an artillery bombardment of the Union lines. General Hood and his men began the attack. The Confederates entered the Devil's Den, which saw very bloody fighting, often hand-to-hand. The Confederates fought their way through Devil's Den and onto Little Round Top. It was here that they met the men of the 20th Maine under the command of Joshua Chamberlain. The Confederates charged the 20th Maine 3 times, but were beaten back each time. After the third attempt, they had enough and began moving off of Little Round Top. Seeing the rebels withdraw, Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets and sweep the rebels from the hill. Chamberlain would go on to great fame for his actions during the Battle of Gettysburg. Retreating back to Devil's Den, the Confederates continued return fire with the 20th Maine, though now they were simply trying to hold their ground. Meanwhile, at 5 p.m., McLaws began his attack into the Peach Orchard, easily overwhelming the Union troops defending the area. The rebels pushed the Union troops into a wheat field, where the fighting turned into a hand-to-hand melee, which was extremely bloody on both sides. The rebels sustained many casualties in the fighting, coupled with more Federal troops being rushed to the area. The attack failed, and the rebels were forced to withdraw. At around 6 p.m., Anderson began his attack towards the Union lines. General Hancock was the commander of the Union center at Gettysburg. He had weakened his own lines in order to support General Sickles, who was receiving the full force of the Confederate attacks. Weakening his lines, General Hancock took a big risk because it was at this weakened spot that Anderson attacked. The rebels had initially success even reaching the top of Cemetery Ridge, if only briefly staying there. Hancock, out of sheer desperation after seeing this, ordered the 1st Minnesota Regiment, who had just arrived in the area, to attack the rebels. They, of course, did what they were ordered to do, and in doing so suffered 80% casualties. Their bravery was not in vain, however, because it bought Hancock enough time to reform his defense position and drive the Confederates back to where they came from. Gettysburg Day 2 was not over yet. At around 7 p.m., Confederate forces began their attack against the Union right flank. This was the demonstration the Lee had ordered Ewell to make. The attack began with some success. The Confederates took some ground and inflicted many casualties on the Federal troops. However, the Union was able to reinforce their lines, and the rebel attackers received no additional support, so their attacks eventually pettered out and failed. This last attack ended the brutal second day's fighting at Gettysburg. Lee came very close to breaking the Union lines. Fortunately for the Union, he failed. Casualties were very high on both sides, each losing around 10,000 men each. A bit shaken up by this, Meade called a meeting that night to take a vote, which corps commanders had, to whether they should remain at Gettysburg and fight, or if they should withdraw. It was an anonymous decision. They would stay and fight. On July 3rd, 1863, fighting resumed on Culp's Hill and cavalry battles raged in both the east and the south. The biggest infantry assault was 12,000 Confederates against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, Pickett's charge. Pickett and his men waited in the forest, and the Union forces stopped firing, so they believed it was safe to come out. The charge was repulsed by Union rifle and artillery fire. The Confederate army took a massive loss. This was a huge turning point for the Union army. Lee was forced to turn back to Virginia, and as many as 51,000 soldiers were either killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The last day of Gettysburg was a huge turning point for the Union army. Lincoln was down and didn't believe he would re-elect because of the countless losses that the Union army suffered. Lee had planned early on to win on either the left or the right side. However, he failed in both directions, and finally decided to go against General Meade's army, to go straight up the middle. And George Pickett's army consisted of around 15,000 men. George Pickett was born in Richmond, Virginia, and was the first of 8 children who were born to Mary and Robert Pickett. Pickett attended West Point as a young man, but finished last at the very back of the 89 surviving students. But no less, he graduated from West Point class 1846. George Pickett entered the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant and was then quickly called to action during the Mexican-American War. During this war, he became a hero by raising an American flag over a captured castle at the Battle of Chapultepec. After he came home, Pickett worked on the Texas frontier, during this time in which he would marry Sally Harrison Minge. However, sadly, in 1851, Sally was giving birth and passed away along with the child. In 1857, while serving in the Washington Territory, he would marry an Indian woman named Morning Mist. However, she too would die in childbirth, giving birth to their son James, who luckily survived. During Pickett's charge, his army lost a massive amount of men due to cannon and musket fire. Nearly 50% of his men were either captured or wounded. Later, after the battle, General Lee supposedly asked how Pickett's division was holding up, while Pickett replied, "General Lee, I have no division." The failure of Pickett's charge would follow him around for the rest of his life, and in death Pickett would remain bitter about the loss. After his defeat at Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett went on to lead his division into the Battle of the Five Forks, which he would also be defeated in. And this, in turning point, would eventually cause the breakdown of the Confederate Army. Sadly for the Confederate troops during Pickett's charge, half of the Confederate Army was left on the battlefield as casualties. Historians have formulated their idea that after the South lost the Battle of Gettysburg, it never did fully recover. This loss was so great that when the Battle of the Five Forks met, they were ill-prepared and had too few men to help fight. Morale was a huge factor in the loss as well. As the war went on, both the South and the North's morale was losing steam. However, the difference in that the South did not have enough supplies or manpower to keep up this long of a war. Along with their soldiers who were homesick and just tired of fighting, another major factor in the Southern defeat at Gettysburg was the fact that General Lee was in ill health before the battle and during the battle. Some would say his tactical decisions during the battle was skewed and not likely to make those decisions. An explanation that was given for his was, some would say, poor decision making was that he had a negative reaction to the medication he was taking to help cure him. The North was able to cope with their large loss of men because they had a large population basis, while the South was much smaller population-wise and could not take a blow like that and win the war. General Lee's army had gone from being strong and fierce that could overtake Philadelphia to a force that would retreat back to the South and never take offensive in the war again. The Battle of Gettysburg was a decisive victory for the Union. Tactically, it may have seemed about even. Both armies lost about the same number of men, and Lee kept his army on the field until the evening of the day after the battle, waiting for a counterattack by Meade, which never came. But Meade's larger army could better afford the losses. All 8 of Lee's infantry divisions lost about a third of their strength, while Meade's largest army corps was virtually untouched. Lee was almost out of artillery ammunition, while Meade had enough for another battle, and Meade had no need to throw himself into a dangerous counterattack. Time was on his side as Union reinforcements moved to surround Lee, deep in enemy territory, with no hope of a reinforcement. Strategically, there was no question. The Battle of Gettysburg stopped the Confederate invasion of the North and forced Lee to withdraw to Virginia. He was successful in his second goal of gathering supplies from untouched northern regions, but his goal of moving the fighting out of war-ravaged Virginia only lasted for a few weeks. By August, the armies were back in the Rappahannock, in Lee's primary goal finally being able to exploit a Confederate victory by pursuing and destroying a beaten Union army would remain an elusive dream. Although it did not involve the largest number of troops, it had the highest casualties of any battle in the Civil War. After the 3 draining days of Gettysburg battle, Lee started a 27-mile-long trek to Virginia consisting of mostly hospital wages. They stopped at the flooded Potomac River where they encountered Meade's army. Prepared for another battle, both armies were in poor shape and had lost most of their ammunition to previous battles. They both decided not to pursue the fight, and the 2 generals were heavily criticized for cowardice. It was all my fault this time. Form your ranks again when you get back to cover. We will all want good men to hold together now. General Robert E. Lee had said this during the attempt to piece together what remained of George Pickett and Joseph Pettigrew's division after these 3 brutal days in Gettysburg. Lee even offered his resignation to Confederate President Jefferson Davis and was refused and remained in command until the war concluded. The end of Gettysburg resulted in an estimated 569 tons of ammunition fired and casualties ranging from 46,000 to 51,000. Nearly 1/3 of Lee's army were killed, wounded, or captured. It also resulted in thousands of wounded soldiers left to the responsibility of civilians. Homes and public buildings became hospitals. The towns were becoming unsanitary and disease-ridden. Along with this mass amount of casualties was Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery, the first cemetery dedicated to U.S. soldiers. The address speech was short, sweet, and powerful. Not only was the Gettysburg battle a very bloody and long-lasting battle, but it is said to have been the turning point of the Civil War. One of the greatest aspects of the Civil War was the technological advancements, from the first photographs of war to the weaponry and transportation. 2 of the main technologies that arose during the war that saw their first major use on the battlefield of Gettysburg were breech-loading rifles and small arms, and major artillery. Archaic medical practices were still presented at Gettysburg, along with outmoded battle tactics where the battle lines evolved based on the muskets with a range less than 100 yards. This was used by both armies and proved to increase the amount of casualties due to the advanced rifles that the soldiers carried that had a range up to 400 yards. It is said to say that the main theme of this battle was utilizing of the new technological advances and the lack of advances on war tactics to match the weaponry.